So first of all, I just wanted to say, I think there's a fantastic link from the presentation we just heard and this panel. And I think the link here is the fact that more and more people right now, when it comes to deployment of technology, they're saying, well, what is this for? Why are we doing this? And this is because, especially over the last couple of years, we've seen probably the best of technology, but we probably have seen also the worst of it. And so ethics has become such a topic at the moment. And I'm delighted that we're talking about it today, and delighted that we're talking about it with this amazing panel here. And I'd actually ask you all to introduce yourself for a couple of minutes, and that'd be really good. And I'll start with myself. My name is Ivana Bartoletti. I head up the privacy and data protection team at GemServe in the consultancy firm here in the city. And just a little bit of publicity around me. I'm about to publish a book exactly on the ethics of AI, which is going to come out in the spring. The work that I do is really around this. How do we translate ethical concerns into practice? How do we build a pragmatic approach to ethics in companies? I'll start with you and then... Yeah.
So my name's Annika Schmeider. I'm a consultant here in London, and people who know me, I've had a long background in development and particularly around data.
So I'm Matthew Gardner. I'm a consultant. I work with tier one banks and central banks, investors, all around the world, really, a lot in Southeast Asia, a lot in Australia and the Middle East. And that work brings me into contact with a lot of lawyers around regulation, a lot of regulators. We see a lot of innovation, but obviously regulation is the last stop. So I'm interested in that and the ethics of that.
Hello.
Yes.
Good morning. I'm not sure if I think it's working. Hi, I'm Alex Jones. I'm the head of emerging futures and technology at the UK Department for International Development. And I spend a lot of time thinking about digital transformation in the countries where we're working, but also AI and technology, both for how we as an agency can be more efficient and impactful, but also what it means for our programs and how we work with the countries that we work with, including the policy and regulatory implications of the tech transformation that we're seeing. Thanks.
I'm going to go next. Can you hear me? Yes, good. Francesco Correa, I don't think that it works. Yes, now it does. Francesco Correa from Balderton Capital. I'm currently the research lead there. I've been doing work with AI for the last 5 years or so, advising companies, investing in companies, and doing research for my PhD back then.
Hi, hello? Yes, my name is Andrea Marmolejo. I specialize in sustainable finance. I have an advisory business and particularly work in ESG integration and impact investing. I started working with AI 4 years ago, approximately.
Great, thank you. So let's get straight into this debate. So we've heard a lot of talk about, and we hear a lot of talk about biased data. The fact that, of course, artificial intelligence, when we use data, it's coming straight out of society. Of course, it replicates the hierarchies that we see in society. But there is much more to that when it comes to the ethics of artificial intelligence. So I'm going to ask you, in your day job, in your work, what are your main ethical considerations that you're faced with? Do you want to start?
Sure. Well, working in impact and also in ESG, as we just heard, this is becoming an increasingly huge vertical for us to really watch. One of the big issues that we face is that a lot of the big tech companies that manage a lot of the data are claiming social benefits. And when we're looking at impact investing, we have a little bit of a mixed messaging. We're trying to understand what is the social component, what is the added value, and what are the things that are escaping that. From an investment point of view, which is a lot of my work is with investors, we're seeing that lack of ethics is becoming potentially one of the biggest reputational, regulatory, and operational risks of a company. So for those AI companies that are able to look forward and understand that there's yet not regulation, but they believe that ethics is something that will help them, they are starting to build a competitive edge. Which I think will be translated into safer assets and probably more worthwhile.
Would you agree with the...
Yeah, I mean, completely. And it's funny because you actually split the panel in investors and not investors. So I'm actually going to build on top of what you... That's fine. I'm actually going to build on top of what Andrea was saying. It's funny because probably you don't know that I've been evangelizing and talking about using AI in VC as well for the last few years. So what she was saying, I'm completely 100% with that, but that's like the way in which we interact with our portfolio companies, potential investments, final consumers, whatever, right? I'm touching on a different point, which is how myself specifically use like AI for my daily job. And for me, like the ethical side is paramount, because I mean, when I look at data, if something comes out that doesn't really sound ethical, or at least like strong enough in some sense, it might actually raise a flag. And I'm giving you like a very basic example. If I look at data and I understand that, I don't know, Italian people are better than anyone else at launching startups, they might be to some extent discriminatory against like other people. This is not because that's the real thing the data are telling me, but because like historically speaking, the data set that we have are already biased themselves. So in that specific respect, you have to be like very careful what you look at and the interpretation that you give to that data set, right?
And that's a very good point. I mean, one of the things that there's a lot of talk at the moment around, how do we work, for example, on the key issues around algorithmic fairness or non-discrimination and bias. And of course, I mean, there are some technological fixes that can be introduced. But for example, on issues like fairness, we're still navigating in different theories about what does it really mean, for an algorithm to be fair, and what kind of technological solution can you implement? Is it statistical? There are different ways to achieve that. So in terms of ethics, so we've heard that this ethics topic is very important and crucial, and I have to say totally echo that, because the conversations that you have with businesses now, ethics always comes up as a key issue. In terms of what it really means, so how would you define ethics? Would you say it's a trade-off? Would you define, how would you define it?
I'd say we're beginning to define it. So there's a big responsibility to work between investors and regulators.
Yeah.
Big responsibility for everybody to begin to define it. I saw a very interesting investor speak the other day. She gave a keynote, and she said to the room, it was a room full of corporate bankers, is there enough diversity in this room to create a product which is suitable for this whole country or for whichever population you want to address? Probably not. So there are some technical issues. There are some issues with data sets, but also there's a lot of traditional bias, which is yet to be eliminated. And how well qualified are we in our privileged sector to actually judge how much integrity our source data has?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably some people say if it's not diverse, it's not ethical, is it? If there is not enough,
yeah.
Exactly. And this is, if that's a very, very, very good point. So ethical considerations, we're talking about the bias, we're talking about we've seen, for example, big ethics question around the use of facial recognition recently. Mm-hmm. Those are big areas where a lot of people are saying, okay, you can have the perfect algorithm, but the question is, do we really need to use it? The fact that something is technologically possible doesn't mean we've got to use it. So in your work, what do you see as the main sort of ethical concerns that people have and customers and consumers have?
Yeah, so I mean, I think for us, I would do a +1 to all the points around data, and happy to talk about that, but I won't, because I think some of that's been covered. What I would say is, for us in DFID, what we're trying to do is actually navigate a kind of nuanced discussion around which bridges the risk of sort of tech misuse with tech misuse. I think there's an imperative for us to think about how, for the work in international development, we make the best possible use of technology. And I think for me, some of the discussion on ethics is around how you do that in a way that balances the risks of misuse with the risks of actually not engaging and not using it properly. I think that, for us, a lot of this is around thinking about who the benefits of this work accrue to. There's a massive kind of gap, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa, on using these types of technologies, the capacity to understand how to use them, but also the business models that support them. We're not, in DFID, we're not in the market for kind of exporting business models from the UK and the US to sub-Saharan Africa and presenting that as a way to engage in this. So I think there's a debate there around how we can do that in a sensible and nuanced way.
That's That's really good to hear, and of course, I mean, there's a lot of debate at the moment around big businesses importing and exporting, and sort of, so that's really good that you have this approach. And I think the issue around trade-off, so you can do something, but who's going to benefit? That's the most important issue, particularly, if you think about the financial sector, where, at the moment, every sort of piece of information is financial data, is becoming financial data. And therefore, we have to really think about, okay, who is this from? Who is going to benefit from that? Annika, you've got a wealth of experience from regulators to... What's your take on it, and what do we need to move forward? Is that regulation? What is it?
So I'm picking up on these points here. I think just for some background on me, I ran the first AI pilot in the World Health Organization, which was a lesson in and of itself. I'm happy to talk about that off record and off the platform. But also spent 6 months working at the UK's Information Commissioner's Office, setting up their international program post Facebook Cambridge Analytica. What I'd say to the audience today, and particularly to DFID and other people who are interested in how you might go about this, there's some great stuff in the foyer here. So, for example, Plan International, with whom I've worked for so many years, it's not funny, are in the foyer. What's interesting about what they're proposing here is that they've had to actually go through the whole rigour of ethics and data protection and laws in other countries just to get what they've got on the table. So my message is for anybody who's looking to set up something around tech and international development is that you really need to do your homework around data governance and ethics, and this will be different in different countries. Also, we've got the Sanger Institute out the front too, doing some really fantastic work around epidemiology, and health data obviously has quite a strong set of ethical frameworks, because when things go wrong, and trust me, things do, I've had to clean up a few things in my career, then you don't want to be in that position. You don't want to be a social enterprise in that position, and you don't want to be an investor in that position. So it's the front end work, it's looking at ethics and regulation by design, which I think is most important.
And this is really important, and I just want to ask you what you think about this, because of course, we have legislation we've got GDPR, for example, and GDPR does talk about issue of fairness, does talk about accuracy, data minimization. There is a lot in there which does apply to algorithms. And in fact, I welcome personally the Information Commissioner Office, which is working on an algorithmic auditing framework which is going to be launched in the spring, to exactly look at these issues. How do we audit algorithms? How do we audit them against fairness, accountability, and security, and that's really, really important. So we've got GDPR, we've got a lot of other things like anti-discrimination legislation, human rights legislation, because all this applies, obviously, to some degrees to artificial intelligence. Is that enough? Are we in the area of needing more, or apply what we've got?
I think we need more governance. We see a lot of voluntary in Singapore that's fairness, ethics, accountability, transparency, a lot of voluntary codes, which are really, really easy to satisfy, but we don't see real rigorous governance. I know the EU are considering introducing a product liability directive around AI. It's an existing directive and bringing that in, but we don't see enough strong governance frameworks. I've seen the ICO call, I think, for the police to stop using facial recognition technology so much, for example. And key issues as well around custody of data. You only have one face. If it's lost and it's hacked, what happens then? It's just one issue there.
And so would you agree? Is that governance? Is that... do you want to say?
Yes, it's fine. I think governance for sure. We need to implement and have an oversight on the rules and the regulations that we have. But I think that regulation in this field, first of all, will be an ever-increasing area because technology keeps evolving. And one of the things that some people are considering, which I find really interesting on the regulatory front, is the unbundling of the utility platform and the content provider. So I think that would help enormously, and also other areas, other issues like data portability across platforms. Today, if you have your mobile with Vodafone, you can still speak with somebody who has a 3 network, and we cannot do that across platforms in the technology digital platforms, and that also needs to change.
Yeah, and it's actually like it's interesting what Matthew was saying before, because we are talking, we need more governance, we need more regulation. That's highly likely, right? But there is like a fine balance between regulate or govern more and actually innovate, which is like the traditional trade-off that everyone is experiencing since the last 50 years, right?
Which is what Macron was talking about the other day. Europe as the third way, the responsible innovator. It gives serious competitive issues. It already has a GDPR, but when you look at the American and the Chinese model, which is entirely different and not so ethics-focused, I would say, at the moment, it does leave us at a competitive disadvantage right now. But how do we get around that?
Well, I mean, to an extent, I don't know if you would agree with me on the panel, but to an extent, ethics could actually be very competitive. I'll tell you why. If you look at the GDPR, for example, yes, I mean, people are complaining, oh God, this legislation, but in the end, it set a global standard. And in the end, every single company around the world that wanted to trade with the EU had to comply with GDPR. So to an extent, if the EU really goes ahead and say, actually, we are going to do a regulation to ensure that there are some ethical principles underpinning AI deployment, then this could actually be a good way to gain a competitive edge rather than the opposite. Sorry.
Go on.
You go first.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Just drawing on that point, I think that's really important. David talked just before about, biased data, how do we get better data for better decision making. This is very true. The basis of that is actually having good unbiased data, and without people's consent to be able to use their data, then you don't end up with complete data sets. You don't end up with the right data for your decision making. And as an ex-statistician, really these are things that are fundamental to the sustainability of your business model over the long term, and whether you can actually, make a difference with what you have. So that kind of economic model almost is just beginning, and I think we need some more work around what that means for social impact.
Would you agree? Sorry, I'm just asking.
Yeah, I fully agree on the point on data completeness. I think also a lot of that is around not only there's an issue around choice and consent, and to what extent people understand what they're consenting to. Also, there's a real consideration around digital data, especially in the countries where DFID works, and lots of other agencies. Not everyone participates digitally, and therefore not represented in the digital data that a lot of this technology that we're talking about sort of sits on top of. So I think that's a real issue. On your point around governance and regulation, I mean, yes, I think we need more governance. Yes, I think we need more accountability. I would also throw in transparency into that mix. I think that's challenging, but I would propose that more transparency and more open source algorithms and applications can aid with the ethics of this tech.
Andrew, did you want
Yes,
to?
I just wanted to add that if we look at history a little bit, recent history, Europe started with ESG investments 20 years ago. The US is now waking up to the fact that actually it's accretive on a financial basis. Also, impact investing was started actually pretty much in the UK, but in general in Europe. And other people are realizing actually this is also accretive and it makes sense. So I wouldn't simply look at short term. When you look at AI, this is the beginning of a very long road. And I believe that, again, we're going to be ahead, and we're starting to identify a big problem. And if we can embed the solution in whatever it is that we do, we're simply going to be ahead. Because regulation will continue to come. We have plenty of evidence of how the data that has been collected already has been misused. And I don't think that anybody will just sit with that information and do nothing. One other thing I wanted to mention about to DFID and in general, talking about how to deal with data, not just from a regulatory and governance point of view, but in terms of the completeness that was talked about here. I had the opportunity to work with blockchain companies that are looking at the supply chain and are linking very big corporates with small farmers, and mostly the information goes from the farmer to the corporate. Perhaps we need to start to ask the corporate to provide information. How much is the average price they're paying for the product? How much they're paying men versus women farmers? So I think that we need to educate, the corporates in this case to be able to include that data.
Thank you. So just to in the last 5 minutes that we have, I wanted to focus on accountability, yeah? And we talked about regulation, but the key thing is how do companies start? Let's say how do you demonstrate that you're following the due process that you need when deploying artificial intelligence? Is that a matter, we've seen Google, for example, setting up an ethics campaign, and then we saw how that went. What are the key steps to really look at the intended and unintended consequences of what you are developing? What is it? How do you build that? What's the first step?
So, ex-statistics background, it's about being really open about your methodology, and realising that it's not just about your algorithm. Where's Nicole? She's going to kill me when I say this, but AI is a system from end to end, right? So you're starting with data at one end that you're putting into a system. This is, similar in a lot of ways to statistical methodology, and being open about your methodology across this whole process, including how you're getting your decisions in the middle and what's coming out the other end. One of the challenges we had with the AI pilot that I did was exactly that we didn't have visibility about what was going on in the black box, in the proprietary black box. And so we opted not to publish. There was nothing to publish from that particular pilot, despite the fact from a methodological point of view, it actually had some really interesting findings. But if we can't say with certainty, as the World Health Organization, which I was then, what's going on in that black box, then I'm not going to use it and I'm not going to invest in it. And that was my decision, and a big learning from that particular project. So I would say actually that, if you're an enterprise using AI, blockchain, whatever else, you need to be really open and visible about what's going on in your system, particularly where you're having a social impact on people's lives. And you have to think from that perspective, and I would say to investors, do the same.
Yeah. Would you agree? You mentioned transparency, so I think you are on the same wavelength there. Yeah.
Very much on the same page, and it'd be interesting to talk offline about the point around to what extent you need to understand what's going on in the black box in order to make draw conclusions about the whole system. Yeah. It's a tricky one. Thanks. Oh, sorry. Can I just throw one other thing? I think for me, one of the things around how do you approach this is actually not to come up with a binary. This is ethical. This isn't. It's around to what extent, what ethical issues are there in the approach that you're taking? What steps have you taken to kind of understand those and mitigate those? So I don't think it's really valid to say, okay, the data aren't biased and what we've done is fine, and therefore the outcome is ethical. I think there's a much more nuanced debate around what does it all look like and how does it add up. Yeah,
and certainly in order to be able to understand what ethical issues may arise from a particular innovation project, whether it's AI or blockchain, whatever it is, you have to have the right structure in an organization in order to look into what the issue may potentially be. What's your view on?
Yeah, I just think we're dealing with emerging technology here, so we're not quite sure of the network effects. It's driven by network effects. The FCA have just published a paper on AI, black box AI. A lot of regulators say this. We're trying to tell consumers what we regulate and what we don't. Why does a computer say no? One example, we can regulate a certain element but not another. It's a historical problem. FX is the same thing. Foreign exchange, you can't regulate all of it. But I think a lot of regulators are finding now you have to say what you can regulate, what you can't, and look out for the external effects. That's why sandboxes are quite useful. We look at PSD2, look at also CDR in Australia. They've now gone beyond financial services. So linking up all of our data between banks, but now in Australia they want to roll it out to utility companies and more too. So big systemic effects, some of which we won't know, and I think that's very important to bear in mind as we move forward.
Yeah, and in terms of ethical consideration, how would investors look at them in terms of saying, would they want to see that there is governance in place? Would they want to see that? How would you evaluate the ethical approach?
That really changes depending on the companies that you're looking at. So of course, if you're looking at companies that deal with ethical issues, for example, you might tend to ask for more framework, right, rather than recommending a movie or whatever it is. Yeah. But the key point, I think, is what Alex was saying before, which is this is not like a 0-1, a binary decision. It's not like good or bad. This is probably the first time in history where we can look at ethics and say this is no longer like a qualitative issue. This is like a technical issue. Because when I build a model, if I want to be as ethical as possible, and I'm just going to be very careful with what I'm going to say right now, but I have to add more constraint to my model. Because if I go for the highest accuracy or the highest precision or whatever it is, I won't probably taking care of all the things that I need to take care of, and you know that, right? But in that respect, I sacrifice accuracy, I sacrifice precision, I sacrifice things that maybe like investors or that people look for. So in that sense, this is like probably the first time that we can attach a number to what it means to be ethical today. That means that, do I want to be ethical enough? Maybe I will sacrifice accuracy. So probably from a regulation perspective, it might make sense to start thinking about what we can do to incentivize companies to be more ethical.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach that you're putting there because, for example, as a privacy person like you, privacy data protection, we do think, for example, that sometimes you can't introduce sensitive data into a model because you're saying you haven't got a legal basis for doing so. But the problem of not having the sensitive data within their system is that you're not making that algorithm aware. So, that's why, the trade-offs become a really important issues, I think. And that's probably, as you were saying, is not yes or no, but it is what is the trade-off here, and how do we navigate that? What would be your final comments?
Yes, indeed. I think there are a lot of trade-offs, but again, we've had them forever. Always, between return and doing something unethical, there's always been that trade-off. So hopefully, people will have their own compass, and we will have more regulation to help in a way. I think that one thing that also complicates matters, and we need to understand, is Internet of Things and how information is now collected from us by gadgets that we paid a fortune for. So it's no longer that we're not paying, so we're the product. I mean, you pay £2,000 for a smart TV, and it's listening in everything you're saying. So I think that there will be, a need for manufacturers to at least be very clear on whether privacy is included. There's this thing now, privacy is not included. So we need to understand what is it that we're buying, what are the terms and conditions, and even some retailers are starting to think that perhaps having only private and secure services in their platforms will be a competitive advantage. So again, I think there's a lot more to come on this. And one thing, as a final comment that you said, I went to a couple of other talks on this, and one thing that is very refreshing is that we have done this before. It does look like a losing battle from here, perhaps, because information has already been used, it's already been collected, but I've been referred to the automobile industry in terms of how many deaths there have been before there were seat belts and speed limits and airbags. We've done this before, and we need to do it again.
Thank you. Certainly, thank you so much for this really interesting conversation. I think we could talk for hours about this. And the most important thing, the most important takeaway is that ethics needs to be taken into consideration, not as an afterthought, but at the very beginning. And it needs to inform all the choices. And also because consumers are becoming more interested in this. So putting ethics at the heart of what companies do is definitely that competitive edge for everybody and for society.
Thank you. And let's thank this absolutely amazing panel. Thank you very much.